Now, as to this, exhibit under glass. You know nothing about it? Nothing whatever. You could not, by examining it, even venture a guess as to what it is? Or has been? I have examined it. I don't know what it is. And it was then that the district attorney received a note in Herbert Dean's writing, read it and laid it on the desk before him. When he looked up, his examination took a new and different angle. Mr. Dalton, he said, do you know of any poison ivy around the crescent? In that vicinity, I mean. Poison ivy? Are you trying to be funny? I'm afraid not. It's entirely pertinent to our inquiry. Brian Dalton shook his head. I don't know of any, he said. I suppose you fellows know what you're talking about, but, poison ivy. Then he smiled rather grimly. You don't know us or you wouldn't ask that. Of course I can't speak for the wasteland behind us, although I've never noticed it there. There was, I believe, a pause here. The district attorney picked up the note from the desk and handed it to the commissioner, who looked surprised but nodded. And it was the commissioner who, note in hand, asked the next question. Just how long, he inquired gruffly, on the afternoon of Thursday of last week, did you stand beside the Lancaster woodshed, Mr. Dalton? He must have looked around him then at that ring of intent faces, all turned toward him. There was no pity in any of them. They were hard, set and grim, like those of men peering into a microscope at some imprisoned insect. Probably after his habit he ran a finger inside his collar, as though it was too tight for him. Then he smiled again. I suppose if I refuse to answer that it will be held against me. I can only repeat what I said before, Mr. Dalton. I was there perhaps 10 minutes. You are certain that is all? Absolutely certain. Will you explain just why you were there? There must have been a reason. If you'll tell us that reason frankly, I assure you we will hold it as confidential, unless, of course, it turns out to have an important bearing on the case. But there he surprised them. Why I was there had nothing to do with this inquiry, he said shortly. If you want a reason for your record, put it down that I was hunting for a golf ball. That's as good as another. It's as far as I care to go anyhow, and you can take it or leave it. That practically ended the interrogation. There was not a man there who did not know he was concealing something, although they could not be certain that what he concealed had any bearing on the case. But there was also not a man there who did not believe that he had lied about his 10 minutes, and that he had stood beside the woodshed of the Lancasters long enough to smoke almost in its entirety one expensive Belinda cigar, made for him in Havana. Although, as the inspector said to me a long time afterwards, that in itself didn't mean a lot. It was pretty hard to believe that in the half hour to 40 minutes he was there that afternoon he could have smoked a cigar of that size and still killed the old lady. And he wasn't smoking either when his butler saw him go or when he came back. A little statement which once more bears out my conviction that from the very start our servants knew more of our crimes than we did. We knew nothing of all this that afternoon, of course. Mother was too fagged to relieve the nurse that afternoon, and Lydia Talbot did it instead. Margaret was still shut in her room, refusing to allow Lydia to call the doctor. Mrs. Talbot was still with ire about George's interrogation, and her Lizzie reported that she was sitting locked in her room, shouting infuriated house orders through her door. In the house nearest the gate Jim Wellington was trying to locate Helen, partly for himself and partly for Herbert Dean, who was annoyed at her absence. And next door to us Laura Dalton was nursing for jealousy and her suspicion, while I dare say Joseph watched her out of eyes that saw a great deal more than they pretended. Holmes was still missing. Chapter 31. There had been a little byplay enacted that Wednesday morning, however, of which I knew nothing at the time. With the household at Miss Emily's funeral and only the nurse in charge of the Lancaster house, Herbert Dean and Inspector Briggs had gone there. The nurse opened the door, and after a short talk with her she went upstairs and returned shortly carrying a small object under her apron.